It's like rain dance.
It is like a rain dance. Hey, I'm Stan Stalnaker. We're back, and we're all talking about the 1.5 degree imperative here at Hub Culture Davos in the Ice House, Innovation for the Circular Economy. Joining me for our next segment is a great friend and a person who I really admire, Julia Jackson from Grounded. Grounded is a great organization that is working on advancing the climate conversation with leaders, and I think you can describe it a little bit better than me, Julia, but we're going to talk about something kind of interesting called feedback loops, and how a feedback loop is impacted by the 1.5 degree climate imperative. So welcome, Julia. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Stan, for having me.
So let's start off with tell us a little bit about Grounded. What is Grounded? What's your mission? And how did it start?
So I come from the wine business. My family owns Jackson Family Wines, and about 2 years ago there were massive wildfires that devastated our community and caused $9 billion worth of damage. And I felt in the wine industry, in terms of the climate crisis conversation, there's only so much I could do. So I decided to take a sabbatical from my family business and launch Grounded, which is essentially a climate solutions platform that convenes policymakers, funders, and climate solutions all in one room and helps accelerate the movement of climate solutions so we can actually start implementing them.
And it's anchored by a conference that you do in March in your family's estate, right? In the Wine Valley, in Sonoma.
In Sonoma, though we are going to be having pop-ups around the world that will transcend the once a year. And thank you. Stan's also on my advisory board, and you've been there from the very beginning. So thank you for all your help.
Well, it's really impressive to see how you've grown the idea and turned it into something that's meaningful. Attending Grounded last year was really special, and first of all, I learned a huge amount, and I also was able to experience people and ideas that I haven't been able to encounter elsewhere. And to draw it all into one place and to do it in the setting that you guys created is really amazing. The conference is March 19th and 20th?
March 19th and 20th.
Yeah, in Sonoma. So if you want more about that, we'll go to grounded.org. But right now we're going to talk about this big idea, which isn't so exciting, called the 1.5 degree imperative. So I mentioned a few minutes ago, feedback loops are a really important thing. Once we hit this target, if the climate warms above 1.5 degrees, we start to get into unknown territory around feedback loops. And what that means is that we hit this target, or we hit this point where the planet warms because of carbon emissions and the impact of the Anthropocene, which is like human impact, because it is human impact causing this warmth. We hit that 1.5 degree threshold, we start to get feedback loops that are uncontrollable. One of those feedback loops is dryness and fire. So let's start with that. Then we're going to move to Siberia, and then we'll finish in the Arctic. So, kind of moving up from the equator through. First of all, we're already seeing drying in the Amazon. We're doing a session tomorrow on the Amazon. But this year, unprecedented fires in the Amazon, unprecedented fires in Australia, a size, practically half of England has burned in Australia just in the last month. Over 1 billion, it's heartbreaking, like 1 billion animals and life forms have died in Australia in the last 2 months. And you have been personally affected in Sonoma because after the fires 2 years ago, tell us about the Kincaid fire.
Yes, so 2.5 months ago, wow, it's been 2.5 months, I just lost my home to the Kincaid fire. So honestly, I feel really lucky to be alive. And what this has done for me is made the climate crisis a lot more visceral. I think when we talk about the climate crisis, it's a very cerebral conversation. And for people to really move forward and implement it, we have to have that heart-brain connection and drive people to action through actually experiencing that we are an extension of the planet. We're not separate from it. So whatever is happening in our environment is directly impacting us. When it comes to feedback loops, one thing that's really important to consider is that between the years 2020 and 2030, in order to meet the 1.5 degree target, we would have to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions 7.6% per year in order to meet that target. Now we're increasing 1.5% per year of global greenhouse gas emissions. So for
and
me,
it's about to go, you know what Bill just said is that it's going up, right? It's
yeah,
the rate of increase is increasing, not going down.
quite rapidly. And when it comes to feedback loops, the one thing the IPCC report didn't account for was rapidly thawing permafrost and what that will mean as a feedback loop in and of itself. So there's 1.8 trillion tons of CO2 and methane under rapidly thawing permafrost. And a lot of the Earth's surface is covered in this permafrost. So at Grounded last year, we featured a solution to thawing permafrost. I only have discovered 3. If there are any of you that know any more, I'd love to hear them. But we showcased Nikita Zimov, who's a Siberian scientist, and he's actually keeping the permafrost cool with grazing animals. So by grazing, they keep the surface level compact and cool, but he'd have to scale a lot of bison, elk, and deer and cattle that can withstand cooler temperatures. So that's a massive feedback loop that's not accounted for in these targets. So I think that's something important to consider.
Do you have any idea, like, for all of us, 1.2 trillion tons, I mean, it's massive. Any idea, like, what that looks like? Do you, like, in reality, like, how do you know how much we're emitting a year now in total? Does anybody in the room know? You know?
40.
A good way to think about it today is that we're emitting about as much as Canada does. At 1.5, it'll be as much as the EU. And if we get to 3 to 4 degrees, it'll be as much as China and the United States. So you've got to think about permafrost almost as another country.
So permafrost is like adding Canada, all of Europe, or China in terms of carbon emissions. And that's on top of what we're doing now. That's not without us doing anything. Yeah, that's great.
Sorry.
And also methane. The methane lakes. Methane is way heavier than CO2. It's a shorter lived greenhouse gas emission, but it's way more concentrated. So you have all these methane lakes bubbling up in permafrost region. I also discovered there's this AFI heat siphon solution, essentially where the siphons can be put in the permafrost and then the heat is attracted and dispersed right above that level. So my team is exploring all types of solutions, whether it be solutions to Amazon conservation, vital carbon sinks, mangroves, thawing permafrost, Arctic ice restoration, you name it. I mean, there's so many solutions out there. I think it's important to consider there is no one silver bullet solution that will reverse the impacts of the climate crisis. We have to be deploying all of them simultaneously. Regenerative agriculture, for instance, would be massive in terms of a solution in sequestering and drawing down atmospheric carbon. Globally, we could actually sequester 1 trillion tons if we scaled regenerative agriculture.
So we could solve the permafrost crisis if we scaled regenerative agriculture. So that's like a little mini solution, right? Like if we're looking at micro offsets, like if permafrost is happening here, it's not about if or maybe doing regenerative agriculture. We have to shift to regenerative agriculture just to account for the permafrost. Is that right?
Yes, I don't know how much that would offset. Actually, it would be, it's important to really model and measure what the impacts of permafrost will be. And I think if you talk to Arctic scientists, there hasn't been enough funding to get the studies on permafrost, which is vitally important. So until there's funding of what will happen if we lose permafrost regions, we don't know the consequences.
And speaking of the science, you are an advisor to the Arctic Base Camp, which are our friends. We worked with them in New York during the UNGA in September and did a great event there. And they're here. They have the Arctic Base Camp up on the Stalnaker Mountain, and I'm actually sleeping there tonight outside in Davos. I'm not sure how that's going to go. I know it's going to be cold. Tell us a little bit about the science and why is Arctic Base Camp important and interesting in this conversation?
Absolutely. I actually love Arctic Base Camp. They're so refreshing because here they are in the middle of Davos and it's a coalition of Arctic scientists founded by Gail Whiteman. And they pitched a tent outside of the Schatzalp Hotel and served instant coffee to any world leader or corporate leader that would come by and listen to Arctic science. And so Greta actually spent the night there last year. I'm not sure if she is this year, but a lot of amazing people will be there in an hour for the launch party. And we have a lot of great Arctic scientists talking about the importance of Arctic science. And that includes the Himalayas, Antarctica, the Arctic, and really as an advisory board member, my mission is to make sure that the science is taken seriously and help Gail's platform be successful. So looking forward to that. I'm not sure if I'm spending the night yet. I might join you tonight.
Maybe we'll get up early. So tell me, just if you had one headline out of Arctic Base Camp, is there a finding or is there anything that is key to their mission or their message right now that you could share with our Facebook audience?
Absolutely. So the tagline, "What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic," is so imperative. I think that when it comes to the climate crisis, the not in my backyard experience reigns very true for people. I mean, it's really sunny right now, but what's happening up there and in the Amazon is all part of one global system. So you can't just isolate various ecosystems without realizing there are massive consequences to the entire biosphere. So that slogan, "What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic," is so, so true. And I think you'll see it at the various events they're going to be hosting this week. So check them out. It's arcticbasecamp.org.
Great, thank you very much. And I know you need to get up the mountain to that event, so we're going to let you go. But I think just to sort of cap off this part of the conversation, the reality is that if we don't hit the 1.5 degree target, and it's going to take change and it's going to take technology to do that, if we pass that, we start to hit feedback loops. And unfortunately, we're already seeing these feedback loops. Like the scale and intensity of fire, which you've experienced personally in Sonoma, the rapid thawing of things that were not accounted for in terms of the permafrost. And then from an Arctic standpoint, they thought that maybe, worst case scenario, we might be ice-free Arctic, which is the north, by 2070. And now they're actually looking at scenarios that by 2030 or not long after 2030, the Arctic could be ice-free. And it's amazing, Gail was actually showing me 85% of the old ice, so ice that's been there for thousands of years, has melted just in the last 25 years. Like 85%, because it's still freezing, but it's all new ice, and this ice is actually much less dense. So 1,000-year-old ice is what they call blue ice. I don't know if you've been to Antarctica. In Antarctica, you see blue ice washing up, and it's actually blue. And the reason it's blue is that really, really old ice gets super, super condensed, and it's actually just, it melts. It's like if you have an aerated ice cube, it melts much faster than a really solid ice cube. So this is what's happening in the Arctic. Even the new ice that's getting formed each year is new ice, it's aerated, and its ability to melt is much, much, stronger.
It actually, so older ice traditionally could reflect up to 80% of sunlight, but new ice is like 30%. And a lot of the older ice is actually escaping through this narrow channel up there called the Fram Strait.
Yeah, between Greenland and Canada.
Yeah, so
it's like a toilet. It goes right out.
Exactly. So there are all sorts of solutions. I mean, you can get into like geoengineering, which is slightly controversial, but ultimately we need to turn off the hose and convert to renewable energy. But we also have to keep in mind that even if we converted to renewable energy and stopped our addiction to fossil fuels, we still have 415 parts per million of carbon up in the atmosphere, which will continue to warm and increase the feedback loops. And I mean, there's Bill McKibben with 350.org and is saying once we pass 350 parts per million, then we're really heading towards some feedback loops. But now we're at 415, and if you talk to some scientists, they say it's too late, some of the doom and gloomers. But there are solutions that could actually draw down that atmospheric carbon. So 1 part per million, I learned a few years ago, is equal to 8 billion tons of of carbon. So that's how much a part per million is. And some people are saying the threshold of no return is 450 parts per million. So we're at 415.
But so it's really scary when you think about that, because when I met Carl the first time, it was in Copenhagen, at the COP in Copenhagen in 2009. And I think at that point we were at around 325, and we'll get you up here in a few minutes, but I think we were at 325, and everyone was like, we gotta stop before we get to 350, because that's gonna be terrible. And then we blew past 350 to 415, and if you're saying this really bad threshold is at 450, it's tough to see how we're gonna not blow past that. But let's end on a high note. Can you give us like something to be encouraged about, and then we're gonna let you go?
Absolutely. So sorry, I don't mean to seem like doom and gloom. It's just we have to be realistic to frame the conversation of why, the urgency of why we need to implement these solutions. Actually, One Earth, founded by Justin Winters, is a phenomenal solution and roadmap for keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees. And there's so many amazing individuals that have solutions, and we just need to de-silo the environmental movement and get way more funding and visibility for these solutions so we can scale them. I'm pretty optimistic that we can, because this is us not really trying, in my humble opinion. I mean, less than 3% of all philanthropic giving goes to the environment. We need to massively scale that up. But it can't just be the environmental NGOs, it has to be all sectors of society, all hands on deck for essentially World War III style mobilization.
Tall order from Julia Jackson. Meanwhile, you actually will enjoy her Instagram account, Grounded on Instagram. I enjoy it.
Yeah, we have a wonderful social media woman.
Lots of great learnings there. I've actually, half the stuff I just talked about, I learned from Julia's Instagram account. So find Julia and Grounded on Instagram. And of course, if you're not following Hub Culture on Instagram, look us up. We're going to be back in a little while with another conversation. I think Pam from the 1.5 Imperative will be up next. Well, it's not the 1.5 Imperative. It's called something else. But you're going to learn all about it when we come back. See you in a few minutes.
Thank
Great.
you,
Thanks,
Stan.
Julia.